So in today's lesson, we're going to be talking about nutrients. So section 10.1a represents the first section in chapter 10 of our final unit, unit 4, animal systems. So let's talk a little bit about nutrients. So there are three main fluid compartments in the human body. It goes without saying that water is very important. So where are those fluid components in the human body? I want you to think about where they might be. So pause the video to think about where all of the fluid in our body might be contained. Here's a diagram to help you think about it. So we can talk about the fluid in our bodies being either intracellular, meaning inside of cells, or extracellular, meaning the extra meaning outside of cells. So, that's one way to kind of categorize the fluid. But in terms of the, compartments or places that we find fluid, we are going to find fluid inside of cells. So that's our first fluid compartment. We're going to find fluid inside of our blood vessels, not as the blood cells themselves, but as the liquid portion of the blood, the plasma. And aside from all the fluid in our blood vessels and inside the cells, there are also spaces in our body cavity where there exists fluid as well, right? So to clarify that for your notes, we have fluid contained inside of our cells, and that includes our blood cells, which happen to also be in our blood vessels. Those are intracellular. We also have fluid inside of our blood vessels, but outside of those blood cells, and that comes in the form of plasma. And we also have all of this fluid in our body that is, in between the cells of our body and the blood vessels, so sort of in some cavity-like spaces. So there we go. I want to talk a little bit about macromolecules. This becomes, for those of you thinking about taking grade 12 biology, nutrients and macromolecules become a big part of our first unit. So when you think of the word macromolecule, what does that make you think of? We've done a lot of work on looking at the roots of words and the prefixes and suffixes. I'm hoping that when you see that that prefix macro, that makes you think of very large molecule. So micro meaning small, macro meaning large. Here's a nice example of one. I would say that this is probably some kind of carbohydrate, like glucose likely. So why are we talking about macromolecules? Most of our nutrients are going to be macromolecules. And during digestion, those macromolecules must be broken down. So why do they have to be broken down, you say? Well, remember that digestion involves the absorption of these nutrients through the walls of various components of our digestive system, which we're going to talk about. And so the only way that they're going to be able to be absorbed by our body is that if they're broken down and small enough to be able to kind of pass through the walls of some of our body parts, including our small intestine. Okay, so they're going to be made of usually typically a certain class of elements, certain types of elements most commonly. If you remember from grade 9 science when you did, molecular models, you might be able to kind of have a guess. So, take a minute to think about, well, what atoms would you expect to see in these macromolecules? Well, I see some carbon, I see, it looks like oxygen, some hydrogen. Those are the most common ones. Carbon is the backbone of life. It is the most common element found in all living things. But often we see oxygen, hydrogen, and in some specific molecules, we'll also see some nitrogen and some phosphorus, right? So those are the elements that we're going to see fairly commonly in our macromolecules. Now, what our macromolecules are often basically these repeating subunits. So if you can imagine, thinking about like maybe, um, for instance, let me back that up a bit here. Let me see if I can do that. If you can think about like a staple, for instance, or not a staple, a paperclip, right? So you can think of each individual paperclip almost as being like a subunit, but then we can join a bunch of paper clips in a row to make a big long molecule, and that molecule we might call a polymer. So that in that case, the repeating unit would be the paper clip. So it would be a polymer made up of paper clips that together make a macromolecule. So not all macromolecules are polymers, but some of them are, and you'll see repeating subunits. So this is an example. It's not anything that you need to know, but it's just to kind of create a visual for you. Polystyrene, which is your like pretty typical styrofoam, is a polymer made up of a repeating unit. And so you can see that this unit right here, so kind of hexagon-y thing, which you'll learn about in grade 12 chemistry, followed by, a carbon and two hydrogens. You see that, there's a repeating unit. So in our styrofoam is a polymer made up of the styrene repeating unit. So we need nutrients, right? And we need them to help us to repair and any tissues to grow, because they supply us with energy. So our nutrient groups are made up of macromolecules themselves. Remember, they're these big, large molecules with lots of atoms bonded together. And in those chemical bonds is a huge amount of chemical potential energy. And when those bonds are broken, we can, there is often energy that can be harnessed and put to use in other ways. So, what are they going to do? They're going to mostly provide us with energy. That is the purpose of our nutrient groups. They're going to regulate, some of them are going to regulate cell activity. So when I say that, I'm thinking like hormones, possibly. Some of them might be enzymes, for instance, which we're going to learn about, that help to control the speed at which reactions happen in our body. And they're also going to be involved, some of them, in building and repairing tissue. So I want you to keep all of that in mind as we move through the next sections. So there are 4 essential nutrient groups that we like to talk about. So take a minute and I want you to think about what those groups might be. Let me just get comfortable here. What might those nutrient groups be? Well, if you can't think of any of them, I'm going to give you one as a hint. There's one of them. One of them is carbohydrates, right? So that is one out of the 4 nutrient groups. What might the others be? Well, think about, the food that you take in. What is it made of? I'm hoping you thought of proteins. You might have said fats or oils, and if you did, you'd be right. Those are lipids is just a fancy word for fats and oils. And the last is nucleic acids. Remember that the food we're eating, whether it is plant food or whether it is food coming from a plant source or food coming from an animal source, those organisms contain cells themselves, and every single cell in an organism's body is going to contain DNA. So the food by consuming foods, we are consuming nucleic acids such as DNA, which is interesting to think about. So we're missing something though. What else is important that we take in when we consume food, right? Aside from those 4 main nutrient groups, what else is it that we find in our food that is important for us in order to remain healthy? Well, I'm hoping that you're thinking about vitamins and minerals. So we don't need vitamins and minerals in the same quantities as we require, say carbohydrates, for instance. So, the carbohydrates and proteins, etc., we would call macronutrients, whereas vitamins and minerals we refer to as micronutrients because we require them in small amounts. Now you might be thinking, well, what is the difference between a vitamin and a mineral? Typically speaking, we would say that vitamins are organic in nature with a carbon backbone that is pretty similar to our macromolecule groups, nutrient groups we just talked about, whereas minerals tend to contain metals. So think, for instance, like calcium or iron. Those are minerals, not vitamins. Whereas vitamins, like vitamin B6, for example, if we were to look at the structure of it, we would see that it likely has a carbon backbone in it. So it's an organic molecule. Those are details beyond the scope of this course, more just an FYI. But there's a table in your textbook, here it is, that kind of denotes some of the key functions of some pretty important minerals and vitamins in our body. So typically when people think of minerals, they will think of calcium and iron. Calcium obviously being important for bone production, iron being important for, oops, let me get back to our last slide. Boom. And, iron being important for our blood. So hemoglobin, just to talk a little bit about this, hemoglobin is a molecule whose function, we find hemoglobin in red blood cells, by the way. And red blood cells have they have within them hemoglobin, and hemoglobin is a molecule whose center is composed of iron. So the job of hemoglobin is to carry oxygen on our blood. It kind of allows our red blood cells to grab onto oxygen. And that is also discussed a lot more in grade 12. But basically, without iron, we can't produce hemoglobin because the iron is a part of that hemoglobin molecule. So without iron, our oxygen can't really be carried very efficiently through our bloodstream on our red blood cells. Often iron deficiency anemia causes tiredness, like pale skin and so on and so forth. Women tend to have iron deficiency anemia more often because of their menstrual cycle. So that's something to be aware of as young women. And that's sort of the connection. So, some others here, magnesium, potassium, sodium. We think of potassium and sodium as being really important for nervous response. Those of you that are taking exercise science in grade 12 or biology in grade 12 will likely see that when we talk about nerve impulse conduction. And then magnesium really important for enzyme function. So those are just a few. We look at vitamins. Oops. Vitamins have a wide variety of importances. I think we are fairly aware of the role of vitamin C in preventing, say, for instance, scurvy. Scurvy was a disease that sailors used to get because they were out at sea for very long and they wouldn't have access to foods containing a lot of vitamin C, so they would develop this scurvy. It's why sometimes people of British ancestry are called like limeys. It's because they would have limes on their ships to prevent scurvy, and lime containing some vitamin C. Many of you may, if you go ahead and read on your milk bag, the main milk bag, you'll often see that it will say enriched with vitamin D. So even though milk has calcium in it, without vitamin D, the calcium isn't easily absorbed by your body. And so the usefulness of the calcium, the mineral calcium, is diminished in the absence of vitamin D, which, by the way, you can also get from the sun. So enough about these nutrients. Let's move on here. I want you to take a 10-minute break. I'm not going to put the timer on now, but take a 10-minute break, get a breath of fresh air, do what you need to do, because this is the end of our first screencast for today.